No one dared befriend the millionaire's son, until a poor girl with a piece of bread sat beside him and changed everything. Andrew Hayes was only 6 years old, but already he carried a name that everyone in his school recognized. He was the son of one of the wealthiest men in the city, and though he never asked for the attention, the weight of his father's fortune hung over him like an invisible crown. His clothes were always spotless, his lunches always carefully prepared by house staff, and his shoes polished until they gleamed under the cafeteria lights. On the surface, he looked like the kind of boy who should have been surrounded by friends, admired and envied, but reality was different. The other children whispered about him in corners, staring but never approaching, as though his family's wealth made him untouchable. When he entered a classroom, voices hushed. When he walked through the playground, space seemed to open around him, not out of respect but from distance. It wasn't that Andrew was unkind or arrogant. In fact, he was quiet, polite, and far more thoughtful than most boys his age. He longed for someone to sit beside him at lunch, someone to share jokes with, someone who would see him not as the millionaire's son, but simply as Andrew. Yet every day at noon, when the bell rang and the cafeteria filled with chatter and clatter, he found himself at the same table, alone. He would unwrap his carefully packed lunch, sandwiches, fruit, and a dessert his nanny had tucked in with care, and then stare at it without appetite. He watched groups of children laughing, sharing snacks, swapping stories about television shows or games, and each laugh felt like a reminder of how separate he was. Sometimes the teachers tried to encourage others to include him, but the attempts always failed. Children are quick to sense differences, and Andrew's difference was one they could not overlook. His father was too powerful, too distant, and even at their young age, they understood that befriending him might mean stepping into a world that wasn't theirs. To them, Andrew's status was intimidating, even suffocating, so they avoided him entirely. Andrew tried to hide the sting of loneliness, sitting with his back straight, pretending he didn't mind, but inside he felt a growing emptiness. He was 6 years old and already convinced that perhaps no one would ever want him for who he really was. That day was no different. He sat at the end of the cafeteria table in his light blue shirt and dark navy trousers, his brown hair neatly combed, his clear blue eyes fixed on the surface of the table. Around him, the room was alive with the sounds of forks clinking against trays, the smell of warm bread and soup floating in the air, and the endless chatter of children forming bonds he could only watch from a distance. He picked up his sandwich, set it down again, and sighed quietly, wondering if this was how every lunch of his life would be, endless, silent, and unbearably lonely. And yet, though he did not know it, that day would not end as all the others had. In the crowd of voices and laughter, someone had noticed him, not because of his last name or the stories whispered in hallways, but simply because he was alone. That someone was a girl whose presence would change everything, though at that moment she was just another face in the sea of children, moving closer with a quiet determination that Andrew could not yet see. At first Andrew didn't notice her. His head was lowered, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the lunchbox he hadn't opened, while the hum of chatter washed over him like background noise. But then the bench creaked slightly, and a small figure slid into the empty space beside him. He looked up in surprise, expecting to see someone who had sat down by mistake, but instead found himself staring into the clear blue eyes of a girl he had never spoken to before. She was about his age, with fair hair pulled back into a loose braid that had begun to unravel by midday, and she wore a plain white dress that seemed a little too thin for the season. In her hand she clutched something small and rough, a single piece of bread wrapped in a napkin that looked as though it had been folded and unfolded too many times. For a moment Andrew didn't know what to say. Children never sat next to him voluntarily, and he waited for her to remember who he was and scurry away. But she didn't move. She settled herself on the bench, unwrapped the bread with careful fingers, and then turned to him with a smile that was small but genuine. "Do you want to eat together?" she asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, yet there was no mockery in it, no trace of the cruelty he had grown used to. Andrew blinked, unsure he had heard her correctly. "With me?" he asked quietly. The girl nodded, breaking her bread in half and holding out a piece toward him as though it were the finest meal she could share. He stared at the offering, his throat tightening, because no one had ever offered him food before. He had cupboards and kitchens full of it at home, yet the gesture meant more to him than anything his family's wealth had ever placed in front of him. "My name's Lily," she said, still holding out the bread. "You look lonely. And it's better not to be." There was no pity in her words, only honesty. She wasn't trying to flatter him or to make him feel guilty. She was simply telling him what she saw, and for the first time, someone had seen Andrew for what he truly was, not a millionaire's son, but a boy sitting alone with no one to talk to. He hesitated before reaching into his lunchbox and sliding it across the table toward her. Inside were sandwiches neatly cut into triangles, slices of fresh fruit, and a small container of cookies. "We can share," he said, his voice shy but hopeful. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of so much food, but she didn't snatch at it the way he half expected. Instead, she placed her piece of bread carefully on the table between them, as though to prove she was giving just as much as she was receiving. They began to eat, not speaking much at first, but the silence felt different now. It was not heavy or isolating, it was comfortable, like a blanket that slowly wrapped around them both. As the minutes passed, Andrew found himself asking questions, small ones, like whether she liked the cookies or if she wanted the apple slices. She answered simply, sometimes smiling, sometimes shrugging, but always with a warmth that made his chest ache. Other children passed by, glancing curiously at the sight of Andrew sitting with someone, but neither of them paid attention. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Andrew wasn't alone. When the bell rang and children began to pack up, Lily stood, brushing crumbs from her dress. She looked down at him with a brightness in her eyes that seemed to cut through the dull ache he usually carried. "See you tomorrow?" she asked, as though it were already decided. Andrew nodded quickly, afraid that if he didn't answer fast enough she might change her mind. "Tomorrow," he said, and for the rest of the day, he carried those words with him like a secret treasure. That night, lying in bed beneath soft blankets in his enormous, empty room, Andrew replayed the moment over and over, the creak of the bench, the smile on her face, the simple offer of bread. It was such a small thing, but it had filled a hollow place inside him that nothing else ever had. For the first time in his life, he looked forward to the next day not because of what awaited him at school, but because someone had promised, even without saying the words, that he wouldn't have to face it alone. The next day Andrew rushed through the morning in a way he never had before. Usually school was something to be endured, a routine of lessons followed by long, lonely hours until the bell rang. But this morning he dressed quickly, his shirt tucked neatly, his shoes tied a little faster than usual, his heart beating with a strange mix of nerves and excitement. For the first time he wasn't dreading the cafeteria bell, because he knew someone would be waiting for him, someone who had sat beside him not out of obligation but out of choice. He carried his lunchbox carefully, not because it contained anything special, but because he was already planning what he might share with Lily. When lunchtime finally came, he hurried toward the table where he usually sat alone, and his chest filled with relief when he saw her already there. Lily was swinging her legs beneath the bench, her small hands folded in her lap, her white dress slightly wrinkled but her face lit with the same gentle smile that had startled him the day before. In front of her was another small piece of bread, this time wrapped in a fresher napkin, and Andrew realized with a pang that it might be all she had brought again. She waved him over as though she had been waiting just for him, and the warmth of that simple gesture pushed away the chill of countless lonely lunches. They sat together, and Andrew opened his lunchbox with more eagerness than he had ever felt. He laid out the sandwiches and fruit, nudging them toward her, and when she hesitated, he insisted softly. "There's plenty. My housekeeper always packs too much. Lily studied his face, as though searching for any hint of pity, but when she found none, she accepted a sandwich and whispered her thanks. They ate slowly, the conversation beginning in small bursts, questions about favorite colors, about toys, about whether either of them liked climbing trees. Andrew found himself laughing at her quick answers, surprised at how natural it felt. For so long he had been on the outside of conversations, but now the words flowed easily, like they had been waiting inside him for someone who would listen. As the days passed, their lunches together became routine. Each noon, Lily came with her little piece of bread, and Andrew brought his box full of food, and they shared without keeping count. Sometimes she offered him a bite of her bread anyway, insisting that sharing went both ways, and though it was rough and dry compared to the food he was used to, Andrew always took it, chewing slowly as though it were the finest treat. They began to trade secrets, too. Lily told him about her small house on the edge of town, about her mother who worked long hours, about the way the roof leaked when it rained, but how she liked the sound of water tapping against a tin bucket. Andrew, in turn, told her about the echoing rooms in his mansion, about how he sometimes felt lost inside his own home, and how the silence at night was so heavy it felt like it pressed against his chest. What struck him most was how different their worlds were, and yet how similar their feelings seemed to be. She had little but love at home, and he had everything but the warmth of companionship, and somehow their lives fit together in a way that filled both their empty spaces. Andrew began to realize that the name Hayes meant nothing to Lily. She never asked about his father's business, never mentioned the cars or the mansion. To her, he was simply Andrew, the boy who sat beside her and shared his lunch. Their friendship did not go unnoticed. Other children whispered more now, some of them sneering as they passed, muttering about how strange it was that Andrew Hayes would spend his time with a girl who wore the same dress day after day and brought nothing but bread. Andrew heard them, and sometimes the words stung, but every time he looked at Lily, he found his courage again. She never seemed bothered by the whispers. Instead, she kept talking to him with the same easy honesty as before, as though the rest of the world didn't exist. He envied her strength, and little by little, it began to grow in him too. One afternoon, as they finished their meal and the cafeteria emptied, Lily leaned her elbows on the table and looked at him with a seriousness that surprised him. "You don't smile much when you're with other people," she said softly. "But you do when you're with me." Andrew blinked, realizing she was right. For a long moment he didn't answer, but then he whispered, "That's because with you, I'm not lonely." She smiled at that, a smile so bright it seemed to light the dull cafeteria walls, and Andrew thought that perhaps, for the first time in his life, someone truly saw him, not the son of a millionaire, not a boy set apart by money or status, but simply a friend. That night, when he lay in bed, Andrew thought of her words again. He remembered the way she had offered him her bread on the very first day, her small voice asking to eat together. He realized then that his life, once marked only by solitude, had begun to change. The cafeteria table where no one sat had become their table, and in that small space of shared food and laughter, Andrew had found something more precious than all the wealth his family possessed. He had found a true friend. It wasn't long before Andrew's curiosity about Lily grew beyond their lunchtime conversations. He wanted to know more about the girl who had walked so easily into his life, who seemed unaffected by whispers and laughter from other children, who treated him like an equal in a way no one else ever had. One afternoon, after classes ended, Andrew found the courage to ask her where she lived. She hesitated at first, her blue eyes flickering with uncertainty, but when she saw the genuine interest in his face, she finally told him. "It's not far," she said quietly. "But it's not like your house." That evening, Andrew sat in the back of his father's car, staring out the window while the driver wound through the wide, clean streets of their wealthy neighborhood. He couldn't stop thinking about Lily's words, about the way her voice dipped slightly when she spoke of home, as though it was a place she didn't want him to imagine. When he asked his father if he could visit a friend after school one day, the man raised his eyebrows in surprise. Andrew had never asked for that before. "Who is this friend?" his father demanded, his voice cool and skeptical. Andrew hesitated, unsure how much to say, but eventually whispered, "Her name is Lily." His father said nothing more, but the look on his face was unreadable, and Andrew quickly learned not to mention her again at home. A week later, Lily invited Andrew to walk with her after school. He agreed eagerly, and together they made their way toward the edge of town, leaving behind the neat sidewalks and manicured lawns of his world. The streets grew narrower, the houses smaller, their paint chipped, their yards overgrown. Lily skipped along as though she belonged perfectly to this place, but Andrew stayed close, his eyes wide as he took in surroundings he had never seen before. Finally, they stopped in front of a small, weathered house with a sagging roof and windows patched with tape. "This is it," Lily said simply, her tone neither ashamed nor proud, just matter-of-fact. Inside, the house smelled faintly of damp wood and soap. The living room was sparse, with only a worn couch and a few mismatched chairs, but the space was clean and carefully arranged. On the wall, a single family photo hung in a crooked frame, showing Lily as a baby in her mother's arms. Andrew noticed right away that there was no father in the picture. Lily's mother, a woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, greeted him warmly, clearly surprised but grateful to see her daughter bring a friend home. She offered Andrew tea in a chipped mug and fussed over Lily, asking if she had eaten, touching her hair with a tenderness that reminded him of something he had never felt at home. As they sat together, Andrew listened quietly while Lily's mother asked about his school, about what he liked to read, about the subjects he enjoyed. He was startled by the warmth in her voice, so different from the cold formality of conversations in his own house. He noticed how Lily leaned against her mother's arm, secure and comfortable, as though this small, imperfect house was a fortress of love. For the first time, Andrew realized how empty his own mansion felt despite all its polished marble and gleaming chandeliers. His house had maids, cooks, and drivers, but no one who ever looked at him with the same softness that Lily's mother showed her. Later that evening, as he walked back with Lily toward the bus stop, Andrew asked quietly, "Where's your dad?" Lily shrugged, her voice low. "He left when I was little. Mom says he couldn't handle being poor, so he never came back." She said it with such blunt honesty that Andrew's chest ached. He thought of his own father, distant and stern, more concerned with deals and appearances than with the boy sitting alone at the dinner table. Both of them had fathers, yet in different ways, they were equally absent. That night, lying in his enormous bedroom surrounded by shelves of untouched toys, Andrew thought about Lily's house. He pictured the crooked photo, the chipped mugs, the way the roof sagged and the windows let in drafts, but he also remembered the warmth of her mother's smile and the way Lily had curled into her side as if no storm could touch her there. He realized that Lily had almost nothing, but what little she had meant more than everything he owned. For the first time, he began to understand that wealth wasn't about what you could buy, but about the people who made you feel like you belonged. And though he had spent his whole life surrounded by abundance, he couldn't shake the thought that Lily, with her bread and her little house, was richer than he had ever been. The following weeks at school were not easy for Andrew. Whispers had begun to spread quickly through the hallways, carrying the kind of cruel edge that only children could manage. The sight of the millionaire's son sitting every day with the same girl in the same white dress, the girl who brought nothing but a piece of bread for lunch, became a subject of endless gossip. Some children snickered behind their hands, others made remarks just loud enough for Andrew to hear. They teased him for lowering himself, for choosing a friend who clearly did not belong in his world. "Why don't you sit with us?" one boy called one afternoon. "Oh, that's right, you'd rather share crumbs." The word stung, but what stung more was the laughter that followed, sharp and unkind, echoing through the cafeteria like a reminder that he was different and always would be. Andrew tried at first to ignore it, keeping his eyes on his lunch or on Lily's quiet smile, but the comments grew bolder. Teachers noticed the way students mocked him, yet most said nothing, too focused on order and routine to intervene. Andrew's stomach twisted each time he walked into the cafeteria, a place that had already been a stage for his loneliness and was now becoming a stage for his humiliation. But when he sat down and Lily greeted him with her steady voice and her soft grin, something in him refused to let go. She never seemed rattled by the words around them. She ate her bread, shared in his food, and spoke to him as though nothing else existed. Her calmness became his anchor, pulling him back each time the world tried to make him feel small. One afternoon, the teasing escalated. A group of boys approached his table, sneering as they pointed to Lily's napkin-wrapped bread. "Is that all you eat? No wonder you're friends with her, Hayes. She's the only one poor enough to need your leftovers." Andrew froze, his fists clenching beneath the table, his face burning. For a moment he considered standing up, walking away, hiding from the weight of their laughter. But then Lily placed her hand lightly on his arm, her blue eyes steady, and whispered, "Don't let them see it hurts." She turned to the boys and simply said, "At least he shares with me. That's more than any of you have ever done." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a strength that silenced them for a moment, long enough for Andrew to feel a surge of pride rush through him. That night, when he returned home, Andrew ate dinner at the long-polished dining table of his mansion. His father sat at the head, scrolling through messages on his phone, barely acknowledging his son. The food was flawless, prepared by professional chefs, but it felt tasteless compared to the meals shared with Lily in the noisy cafeteria. Andrew wanted to tell his father about the teasing, about how cruel the other children were, about how Lily had defended him, but he knew the man wouldn't understand. His father would have told him to ignore it, to focus on his studies, to remember his place as a Hayes. Yet Andrew realized he didn't want to live only as a Hayes, he wanted to live as someone who mattered for more than his last name. The next day at school, the whispers returned, but Andrew carried himself differently. He sat down beside Lily with his head held higher than before, opened his lunchbox, and offered her food as though daring anyone to challenge him. When the same group of boys passed by, one muttered a cruel remark, but Andrew turned to him and said firmly, "She's my friend. If you don't like it, don't watch us." His voice trembled slightly, but the conviction behind it was enough to surprise them into silence. Lily smiled at him afterward, her eyes shining with gratitude, and Andrew realized that standing by her felt better than hiding from the rest of the world. It was during those days that their bond deepened. They began sharing more than food, they shared stories and dreams. Lily told him how she wished she could take her mother on a holiday to the seaside, where they could walk barefoot on warm sand and forget the struggles of everyday life. Andrew admitted he often dreamed of running away from his mansion and living somewhere small but filled with laughter, somewhere that didn't echo with silence. In each other's dreams they found echoes of their own, and slowly Andrew began to see that what they had was rare, something the other children couldn't understand because they had never looked beyond the surface. By the end of that week, Andrew knew something had shifted inside him. He had faced laughter and ridicule, but instead of breaking him, it had shown him what truly mattered. He would rather endure the sting of cruel words than return to the emptiness of sitting alone. Lily had walked into his life with nothing but a piece of bread and an honest smile, and somehow she had given him more than anyone else ever had. And as he sat across from her, watching her nibble carefully on half a sandwich while her braid slipped loose over her shoulder, Andrew realized that no matter what the others thought, he had found the one person who made the world feel less lonely. One evening not long after the teasing had started to fade, Andrew's world shifted again when his father finally confronted him about Lily. The two of them were sitting in the vast dining room, the air filled with the clinking of silverware and the faint hum of distant staff in the kitchen. Andrew had grown used to the silence at that table, but that night his father looked up from his meal and spoke in a tone sharper than usual. "I've heard rumors," he began, his voice heavy with disapproval. "You've been spending all your time with a girl who doesn't belong in our circle." "Who is she?" Andrew's fork froze in midair, and for a moment he thought about lying, but then Lily's face flashed in his mind, her steady blue eyes and her soft voice telling him not to let others see that it hurt. He set the fork down and said, "Her name is Lily. She's my friend." His father's expression hardened. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? They're whispering that my son chooses to sit with a beggar instead of children who are his equals. That is not the image we present to the world." Andrew's heart pounded in his chest, but he felt a spark of anger flare within him, a spark he had never dared show before. "She's not a beggar," he said firmly. "She's the only person who doesn't care that I'm your son. She talks to me because of who I am, not because of what we have." The words spilled out faster than he expected, but they came from somewhere deep inside, from the loneliness he had carried for so long. For a long moment his father simply stared at him, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by his quiet, obedient son. "Friends are chosen carefully," the man said at last, his voice cold and deliberate. "You should associate with people who can raise you higher, not drag you down." Andrew clenched his fists beneath the table. He thought about the laughter in the cafeteria, the way Lily had defended him when the boys mocked him, the way she had shared her bread even though it was all she had. She had never dragged him down, if anything, she had lifted him higher than anyone ever had. For the first time in his life, he met his father's stern gaze and refused to look away. "I don't care about higher or lower," he said, his voice shaking but steady with determination. "I care about real." The silence that followed was thick, heavy enough to make Andrew's stomach twist. He thought his father might shout, might send him to his room or forbid him from seeing her, but instead the man leaned back in his chair, his blue eyes unreadable. "You're young," he said finally. "You'll understand one day." With that, he returned to his food, dismissing the subject as though it were closed. But for Andrew, it was only just beginning. He realized as he sat there, staring at his untouched plate, that he had crossed an invisible line. He had chosen to stand up for something, for someone, and even if his father didn't understand, he knew he could never go back to the way things were. The next day at school, he told Lily what had happened. They were sitting at their table, the cafeteria buzzing around them, when he leaned close and whispered, "My dad doesn't want me to be your friend." Lily's face fell for a moment, her small hands tightening around her napkin-wrapped bread, but before he could explain further, she asked quietly, "Are you going to listen to him?" Andrew shook his head fiercely. "No. You're my friend. I don't care what he says." Relief washed over her face, and in that instant Andrew knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as long as it meant keeping her by his side. That afternoon, as they walked out of school together, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement, Andrew felt something he had never felt before. He felt strong. Not because of his father's wealth or his family's power, but because he had made a choice for himself. He realized that standing beside Lily had given him a voice he didn't know he had, a courage that had been buried under years of silence. And though the road ahead might not be easy, he knew he would rather fight for this friendship than surrender to the empty life he had before. That night, lying in his massive room with its rows of toys and shelves of books, Andrew thought again of the small, crooked house on the edge of town, of Lily's mother's tired smile, and of Lily herself, sitting proudly beside him despite everything. He understood now that love and loyalty were more valuable than anything money could buy. For the first time, he felt certain that he had found something worth protecting, even if it meant standing against the very man whose shadow had defined his life. Not long after Andrew had defended Lily to his father, a shadow fell over her world that neither of them could have anticipated. One morning she came to school later than usual, her hair more unkempt than before, her white dress slightly rumpled, and her face pale with worry. When Andrew asked if she was all right, she hesitated, biting her lip as though the truth was too heavy to share, but eventually her shoulders slumped and she whispered that her mother had fallen ill. At first Andrew thought she meant a simple cold, something that would pass with rest and tea, but the fear in Lily's eyes told him it was far more serious. Her mother had been weak for weeks, she explained, often too tired to stand for long, and the little money they had was not enough to pay for proper medicine. Lily's voice trembled as she admitted they had been living on even less food than before so her mother could save what little strength she had. The word struck Andrew like a blow. He had never once worried about medicine or food, his world was full of abundance he hardly noticed. Yet sitting across from Lily, seeing the way she clutched her bread more tightly than ever, he felt powerless and guilty for having so much while she had so little. All afternoon he could not focus on lessons, the image of her worried face filling his thoughts. When he returned home that evening, the mansion felt colder than usual, its polished marble and endless rooms more hollow than ever. He pushed his dinner around his plate, appetite gone, while his father spoke idly about a business deal as though nothing outside their world of numbers and contracts existed. Andrew's chest tightened until he finally blurted out, "Lily's mom is sick." His father looked up from his glass, surprised, and for a moment Andrew thought he had made a mistake. But then he pressed on, his voice urgent. "She needs medicine and they don't have money. She could die, Dad. Can't we do something?" The room grew silent except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the wall. His father set his glass down, studying him with an expression Andrew couldn't quite read. "And why is this our concern?" he asked at last, his tone calm but detached. Andrew's frustration boiled over. "Because she's my friend. Because no one else will help her. Because you can." There was a long pause, and for the first time Andrew thought he saw something flicker in his father's eyes, not irritation, not dismissal, but something quieter, almost like reflection. The man leaned back, his brow furrowing as though he were remembering a time long buried. At last he spoke, his voice low. "You care about her that much?" Andrew nodded fiercely, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "More than anything. Please, Dad." The following days blurred into a whirlwind of worry and hope. Lily missed school for several days, and Andrew felt each absence like a heavy weight pressing against his chest. He feared the worst, until finally she returned, her face tired but her smile faintly hopeful. She told him in hushed tones that her mother had been taken to a proper clinic, that doctors were giving her medicine, and that someone had paid the bills. Andrew's heart leapt, and when he asked who, Lily shrugged and said they never told her. That evening, when Andrew came home, he found his father in his study, papers scattered across the desk, a pen in his hand. He stood in the doorway, watching the man who had always seemed distant and untouchable, and for the first time he noticed the exhaustion in his father's eyes. Without looking up, his father said quietly, "Your friend's mother will be fine. The treatment is taken care of." Andrew swallowed hard, his throat thick with gratitude he didn't know how to express. He wanted to throw his arms around his father, but something in the man's posture stopped him, as though his father wasn't ready for that kind of closeness. Still, it was enough. For the first time in his life, Andrew felt his father had listened, not as a businessman calculating returns, but as a father acknowledging his son's heart. The next day at school, Andrew and Lily sat together as always, but this time there was a lightness between them that hadn't been there before. She told him her mother was already looking stronger, that her smile had returned, that the nights no longer felt so frightening. Andrew smiled back, and though he didn't tell her about his father's role, he knew in his heart that the world had shifted. Something fragile and powerful had been set in motion, and it wasn't just about saving her mother. It was about proving that kindness could reach across the walls built by money and status, and that even in the coldest of places, compassion could take root. That night, as Andrew lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized that Lily had changed not only his life but his father's as well. She had shown them both something they had forgotten, that people, not wealth, were what truly mattered. For Andrew, the certainty grew stronger with each passing day, he would never let her face the world alone again. Spring arrived slowly, and with it came a transformation that neither Andrew nor Lily could have predicted when they had first sat together in the cafeteria months earlier. The air grew warmer, the trees outside their school burst into bloom, and the weight that had hung over Lily's life seemed to ease as her mother recovered strength each day. Andrew saw the difference immediately. Lily's eyes, once shadowed with constant worry, now shone brighter, and the corners of her smile curved upward more easily. She still arrived at school in the same white dress, still brought bread some days, but there was a new energy in her step, a lightness in her laugh that reminded Andrew of the way children were supposed to sound. For him, each shared lunch felt like a victory, proof that the world could bend in their favor even when everything had seemed hopeless. One afternoon, as they sat together under the shade of a tree on the playground, Lily told him quietly that her mother was talking about finding steadier work again, something that would keep them safe and secure. Her voice carried both excitement and relief, and Andrew realized how much courage it had taken for her to live through those uncertain months without losing hope. He listened as she described her dreams of one day moving to a house with a proper garden, where her mother could grow flowers and she could finally have a room of her own. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment, imagining her laughter in a place filled with warmth and light, and when he opened them again, he promised himself silently that he would do everything in his power to see that dream come true. The whispers at school hadn't disappeared completely, but they no longer held the same sting. Children still glanced curiously at the millionaire's son and the girl with the worn dress, but Andrew had learned to meet their eyes without shame. He held his head higher now, not with arrogance but with certainty. What others saw as strange or beneath him, he saw as the most important choice he had ever made. Some of the children even began to soften, their laughter fading when they realized that nothing could shake the bond between Andrew and Lily. A few brave enough to approach discovered that Andrew could laugh, that Lily's smile was contagious, and slowly the cafeteria no longer felt like an arena of isolation but a place where something genuine had grown. At home, things had changed too, though subtly. His father was still the same commanding presence, still consumed by business, but sometimes Andrew caught him watching with an expression that was less severe than before. Once, at dinner, his father asked unexpectedly how Lily's mother was doing, and though his tone was neutral, the fact that he asked at all startled Andrew. It was not a question of appearances or reputation but a simple acknowledgement of someone else's life. In that moment, Andrew felt a flicker of something he hadn't known he wanted, the possibility that his father was beginning to see the world through different eyes. As the school year neared its end, Andrew and Lily found themselves sitting together on the steps outside, watching the sun sink behind the buildings. The golden light washed over them, and for a long time neither spoke. Finally Lily turned to him and said, "Do you remember the first day I sat with you? I thought you looked so lonely." Andrew smiled faintly, remembering the way she had placed that small piece of bread between them, an offering that had meant more than any feast. "I was," he admitted. "But then you came." They fell into silence again, comfortable and unhurried, the kind of silence that belonged only to true friends. That evening, when Andrew returned to his enormous room and stood at the window overlooking the manicured lawns, he thought of all that had changed since that first day in the cafeteria. He remembered the sting of isolation, the whispers, the weight of his father's expectations, and then he remembered Lily's small, determined smile as she asked to eat together. It seemed almost impossible that something so simple could have reshaped his life so completely, yet it had. He no longer felt trapped in the shadow of his last name. He felt seen, valued, and alive. In the quiet of that room, Andrew understood something with a clarity that would stay with him forever. The world would always try to measure worth by status, money, and power, but true wealth was something else entirely. It was found in the courage to sit beside someone when no one else would, in the loyalty that refused to waver when the world whispered cruelly, in the love that healed not only bodies but spirits. Lily had shown him that, and in return, he had discovered a strength within himself he never knew he possessed. From that day forward, Andrew no longer feared the loneliness of empty tables or the coldness of marble halls. He knew that as long as Lily was by his side, he would never face the world alone again. And though they were only 6 years old, both children carried within them the knowledge that what they had found together was something unshakable, something rare, and something that would outlast even the harshest of storms.